Because when you talk about these individual countries, they are of declining power on the world stage, UK and France in particular. But Europe collectively is 450 million people, an economy the size of the United States and China. And so the question is, can it really assert itself in the Middle East or have a presence in the Middle East that reflects its potential power?
Welcome to Babel, Translating the Middle East, a podcast from the Middle East Program at CSIS. Here on Babel, we take you beyond the headlines to take a closer look at what's happening in the Middle East and why it matters. This week on Babel, I speak with Max Bergmann, head of the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia Program here at CSIS. Previously, Max held a variety of positions in the State Department, including senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs. He later went on to serve as a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, where he researched security cooperation between Europe, Russia, and the United States. Together, we discussed the Middle East issues that unite and divide European countries and how Russia's invasion of Ukraine may be reshaping European perspectives on the Middle East. Then I continue the conversation with Martin Pimentel and Will Todman to evaluate the benefits and costs of U.S. unilateralism in the Middle East. To translate some of what's happening in the Middle East, this is Babel. Max Bergmann, welcome to Babel.
Thanks so much for having me.
We talk about Europe, and I think when we're talking about Europe and the Middle East, we're really talking principally about three countries, France, the UK, and Germany. How aligned are they on Middle East issues, and how important is the Middle East to their general foreign policy? Have they had the same pivot to Asia that the United States has had? Do they really care about the Middle East?
I think with those three, you have a general alignment. But the Middle East has principally become a place of concern when it relates to migration. So there's a real focus across Europe on the need for stability, first and foremost, for fear of another waves of migration that then really upsets liberal European politics effectively. But there has been a pivot away from the Middle East, no doubt, but that pivot really has been toward Russia, much less so toward China, because Russia is engaging in a war on the European continent, and that's the principal focus of European policymakers. And then because of the United States really emphasizing the growing concern over China and making China its number one priority, that has therefore become Europe's number two priority in how it views the world. But all three of those countries, I think, have a real interest in maintaining stability in the Middle East. And you see the UK and France in particular playing a role in the Red Sea, playing a role in the Gulf. And I think that will continue. I think the larger question, though, is can Europe develop a more cohesive foreign policy as effectively the European Union towards the Middle East? Because when you talk about these individual countries, they are of declining power on the world stage, UK and France in particular. But Europe collectively is 450 million people, an economy the size of the United States and China. And so the question is, can it really assert itself in the Middle East or have a presence in the Middle East that reflects its potential power?
But even as individual countries, I mean, the Russian economy is arguably the size of the smallest G7 economy, Canada.
Yeah.
But the German economy is much larger than the Russian economy, the British economy, the French economy. Why is Russia able to be an actor in the Middle East and Europe, either collectively or even individually, on issues that Europe thinks are important, like migration, isn't consequential?
Not to paint the Middle East with a broad brush, but I would say it's a hard power region. And Russia entered Syria with hard power. It's a player in the region, I think, because it has a military presence. It cuts military deals. Now, the Europeans do some of that. There's French arms sales, UK arms sales to Gulf countries. But Europe is very weak when it comes to hard power and doesn't assert its hard power collectively. So you have individual countries like France and the UK with a real presence. France particularly, I think, playing a role in Syria and in a naval capacity. But these countries are also stretched. When you look at France and the UK, they both struggle with trying to play a global role, trying to have a role in the Indo-Pacific alongside the United States, trying to play a presence in the Middle East, trying to be the backbone effectively of a European pillar of NATO. And they can't really do it all. And that is one of the major post-imperial challenges that both the UK and France are in some ways going through. And I think when you look at what are they going to cut out here, increasingly looks like the Middle East is where it's going to be hard for them, I think, to maintain the same level of presence that they've had historically.
But it also seems that one of the evolving changes is they have been used for decades to being aligned with the United States. Now, as we've seen in Ukraine, the European instinct, certainly the larger powers in Europe, may not have the same instincts as the United States. They may have to act increasingly independently. Is there a way in which Europe really does figure out how to act either in a different kind of complementarity with the United States against U.S. instincts, against U.S. priorities, or does the overwhelming need to act in Ukraine mean that Europe has no bandwidth to do anything else?
We're in a really dynamic moment in European politics. To paraphrase Lenin, it feels like decades are happening in weeks. And there appears to be a real paradigm shift in Europe where I think they're beginning to reckon with the potential for a post-American future. And what I mean by that is that there's been a grand transatlantic bargain between the United States and Europe where the United States provides European security, that's the U.S. role. The Europeans need to spend more to then contribute to a U.S.-led effort to protect Europe. And the Europeans are fine with that. And it means that if the United States goes to Afghanistan, the Europeans are there. If the United States asks the Europeans to do sanctions against China, export controls, they do it. But what we're beginning to see now is, I think, the emergence of a decoupling. And so what does that potentially mean for the Middle East? One, I think there is a real likelihood, this has been talked about for a while, of Europe dramatically investing in its hard power capacity, building up its defense industrial capacity to support Ukraine and to arm itself. But then once you have done that, once Europe really begins to be militarily powerful to deter Russia, that then also has global implications, and I think implications for the Middle East, both in terms of potential arms sales, but also in the potential for the Europeans to be called on to play certain roles, whether it's naval capacity in the Mediterranean, Red Sea, or the Gulf, or just flexing its muscle as having lots of air power and other capacities. That's, I think, still years away, but that's something we could see. The other element is that the Europeans still really believe in the liberal international order. They believe in open markets and free trade. They believe in human rights and democracy promotion. They believe in foreign aid. You know, when we talk about the United States being the largest foreign aid donor with the collapse of USAID, I mean, it's sort of true, but it's actually not. The European Union is by far away the biggest aid donor because when you take the EU and the Europeans collectively, they provide 20 billion more than the United States. So what we would see is the Europeans increasingly in this new realpolitik world sort of divorce the United States, really pursuing their own interests. And as I mentioned, their interests, I think, first and foremost will be stability. So they're cutting deals with Egypt and Sisi. So they've shown an ability to put kind of a very realist hat on. They've cut migration deals with Erdogan and have developed their own common European border force, which is accused of human rights violations. So they've had this hard edge on migration. But I think you'll then also see trying to promote stability in Lebanon. They just today announced the removal of sanctions towards Syria. So I think we could see the Europeans increasingly pursuing their own path, and that may run into some challenges internally for Europe when it comes to Israel and potentially Iran as well.
Europe has been deeply involved in diplomacy on Iran. Europe is certainly closer to Iran. Every war game I've done that involves an Iran nuclear breakout has involved Europe sitting on its hands and calling for diplomacy at a time when ultimately the United States takes action. What would a more robust European approach to Iran look like? What would its elements be? Would you have the UK, France, and Germany acting in concert, or is there the possibility of one or more of those countries acting alone?
I would sort of take a step back and say that I think this isn't going to be something the Europeans are going to pursue right away because it could get them into conflict with the United States, and there's going to be so many other collisions that we're having between Europe and Washington, and I think they'll in some ways try to avoid it. When I think about Iran, though, the problem is the Europeans can't guarantee the one thing the Iranians, I think, want, and you tell me if I'm wrong, which is that for the United States to not attack it, right?
And they want economic normalization with the United States. And because of the U.S. involvement in international financial regulations in the dollar.
Yeah.
Europe can't really get by that. Although Europe had tried and was unsuccessful.
Right. What I could see is Iran is providing support to Russia. It's not as consequential as it was in the early days of the war in 2022 when they provided lots of drones. A lot of that production is now in Russia, but they have provided recently ballistic missiles. So if there's going to be any sort of deal, what the Europeans would want is for Iran to stop that. Now, the question of sanctions, I think, is really important. There's going to be a lot of conflict between the United States and Europe when it relates to things like the International Criminal Court, where the U.S. has now put in place sanctions. And it is now sort of being discussed. What is the challenger to the dollar? It's actually the euro. And so if the collisions between Washington and Brussels really get out of control, and we see the Europeans spending a lot more on defense, borrowing a lot more, it may be that Europe is willing to then take some financial risk vis-a-vis the United States. If the United States ever opens up to being willing to negotiate with the Iranians, I think the Europeans would be very much in favor of that, particularly if it could include provisions or stipulations that Iran stop its support for the Russian war effort.
But it feels like there's a sequencing issue that some of the changes you're talking about are going to evolve over 10 or 20 years. Yeah. With the Ukraine war, the Europeans are trying to find ways to cooperate with the Trump administration in the coming weeks. Is it possible the Middle East provides any opportunities for collective action between the U.S. and Europe, where the Trump administration feels Europe is providing essential support and that helps drive cooperation on Ukraine? Or is it more likely we'll sort of do parallel play and we will do what we do and Europe will do what it does, and we kind of ignore each other in the Middle East?
I think ideally our efforts would be coordinated. And I think you can see some of that in Lebanon, how there has been both the U.S. and the European Union are providing security assistance to the Lebanese armed forces. And perhaps in Syria, where it's I think, interest in both parties to not have a Russian military presence, to see this government emerge and move in maybe not a democratic direction, but at least in a non-anti-Western direction. I think the Middle East as an issue area is, especially just from a European perspective, is now very much downstream from these other critical front and center issues, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's their own defense and the potential for the U.S. to withdraw forces from Europe, which looks quite possible, whether it's clashing on trade, on tech regulations, all these other things are going to consume transatlantic relations. And my guess is that that begins to infect transatlantic cooperation when it relates to the Middle East. And we increasingly see Europe and the US probably just sort of pursuing different policies or staying out of each other's way, maybe cooperating at kind of the working level, but not making it a huge political deal. And I could be wrong there. Maybe this is a place where there's real potential for cooperation. But I think there's divisions within Europe also when it comes to Israel. Trump's comments on Gaza were, I think, greeted with shock throughout Europe. But we see splits within Europe where Spain, for instance, has taken a very sort of pro-Palestinian position while the Germans remain very attached to supporting Israel. So there's a degree of lack of coherence in Europe about the Middle East. And that may evolve over the next few years, but I don't see it happening immediately and impacting how transatlantic relations progress.
I want to talk about Palestine and Israel. Do you see a way in which Europe is consequential in what the U.S. does? Is there a way in which European countries either make a big difference supporting the United States or make a big difference undermining U.S. strategy because they see it as contrary to their interests? Again, not so much Europe as the European Union consensus-driven, but Europe as a collection of wealthy, powerful countries that have their own sense of national interest.
I think Israel is an issue that is going to lead to some clashes between Europe and Washington. It's not collective European Union, but this is a case where there are going to be some European countries that I think are going to support UNRWA, that really support the Palestinians, are going to try to take action against Israel, particularly relating to Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza. So for many Europeans, Israel's war in Gaza is sort of a breaking point. It's very hard to go back to have a positive relationship with Netanyahu and this Israeli government. So I think that will lead to clashes with the United States, particularly if the US maintains its current stance. I don't exactly know how that will evolve. The major feeling in Europe is one of helplessness when it came to the war. And I think what we see from the Trump administration in particular is total apathy, really, toward Europe and towards the transatlantic alliance. So not really caring what a lot of Europeans have to say. So I think Europe's ability to then influence US policy, I think is going to be very weak, very limited. I don't really see that shifting unless the Europeans figure out a way to make themselves impactful. But when I think about all the things on the European to-do list, this is further down the list. And because it's sort of divisive within Europe, it's hard to see Spain itself being impactful. I think it would need to be a more collective European action, and that's where it's going to be difficult.
When I talk to people in the U.S. military, the legacy of European ineffectiveness on Libya still looms large.
Yeah.
Does it loom large in Europe? Is there a sense that Europe was tested and failed? Or is there a sense of there's only so much you can do, you have to have limited expectations?
When you think about the Libya operation, America sort of misunderstood the bargain that it did with the Europeans. That the bargain was that the United States handles the hard power side, and we just want some European pilots to fly next to American pilots. We want some Europeans to die alongside of us. But we have opposed, since the end of the Cold War, the Europeans integrating and organizing themselves collectively on defense. We've opposed the European Union doing anything on defense. So to then sort of step back, as we did in Libya, and quote unquote lead from behind and say, here, you Europeans run this operation, in which they're not structured to do that, it was no surprise that it was pathetic and limiting. It also reflected the fact that Europeans had vastly underinvested in defense. So a lot of this is on the Europeans. But I think what we see right now is Europeans reckoning with that reality, with the potential for the United States to substantially withdraw its forces, that the United States is, I think right now, at this moment, not seen as a reliable protector of European security. My guess is how Europe acts to address that doesn't solve the problem. We're not talking, in 10 years about an EU military that's like the US military. But I think we will see real concrete steps that mean if there was sort of a Libya 2.0 that needed to happen in 2030, that the Europeans would be much more capable of taking that on. And in fact, I think they're already much more capable of taking that on. So that was a bit of a wake-up call, but that wake-up call, the alarm had been going off in Europeans had sort of been hitting snooze, and now they're up out of bed.
Well, let's say we're trying to give them some coffee. Look, clearly the Europeans are looking for ways to build patterns of cooperation with the Trump administration. Do you see anything in the Middle East that could or should be a shared project that will show Europe's capacity, show Europe's seriousness, show Europe's commitment, show the importance of transatlantic cooperation, not only for European interests, but for U.S. interests as well?
I do think that there's a real opportunity for Europe to play a really big role in both Lebanon and Syria. Both economies are shattered. Both are, I think, at this sort of critical turning point. And I think Europe entering the space, both from an aid perspective and in a military assistance perspective and a diplomatic perspective to provide some credibility to both governments potentially, strikes me as the Europeans actually have a lot to offer to both countries, which then means that I think the United States shouldn't ignore the Europeans when it comes to both those countries. And so if I were the EU, if I were the UK, France, Germany, that is, I think, where I'd focus my efforts. And I think that's what we're beginning to see with European foreign ministers going to Damascus, the removal of some sanctions vis-a-vis Syria, and in trying to bring both governments to both make them more stable and make them more friendly with Europe and, I think, Western countries.
Max Bergmann, thank you for joining us on Babel.
Thanks so much for having me.
Is the U.S. likely to be less successful resolving Middle Eastern conflicts without close European cooperation?
What does success look like? How likely is the United States to be successful either with or without European cooperation? I think for a lot of Americans, the U.S. hasn't been especially successful in the Middle East, and therefore European cooperation doesn't really matter. Another way to look at it, though, is that the United States actually has been quite successful in preventing large-scale interstate war in the Middle East for the last 50 years. Whether that becomes more likely, less likely, I suspect a lot of it will hinge on where things go with Iran over the next 10 to 15 years, what future presidents' attitudes toward Iran will be, and what future European attitudes toward Iran are going to be. I think one of the interesting questions is whether a more militarily robust Europe would seek a different policy toward Iran than Europeans have sought for the last several years. But it also depends on what kind of government you have in Tehran and what they're trying to do with the rest of the world. So I can't give an answer, but I also can't quite figure out what success is going to look like either.
Theoretically, I would have thought that more independence for the US could mean some more flexibility in the kinds of peace initiatives that the US pursues. So taking, for example, Israel and Palestine, I think it has been established for decades that Europe is firmly in support of a two-state solution, and the United States has been as well. Theoretically, a US on its own, not caring about coordinating with Europe to the same degree, could say, we have tried this for a long time, this doesn't work, we're going to come forward with an initiative that is very different, and that could have greater chances of success in the current conditions. It also could be far less successful, but I think there's maybe some more flexibility to break beyond some of these established norms as to how conflict resolution and peace building in the region could go. But of course, that comes with a cost as well. If you don't have a united stance between the US and Europe as it relates to sanctions, I mean, Jon, you and Max talked about this during your conversation, then you are only undermining the amount of leverage that the US can bring to the table if you are not including the European economy as part of that and all of the leverage that comes from combining forces with Europe. So I also think we could see the US being a bit more selective in the kinds of conflicts and peace negotiations that it wants to get involved in. And we could see just a far smaller US role in some parts of the region than it has previously played. After the election of the new president in Lebanon, I wrote a piece arguing that I think in some ways this actually decreases the degree to which Lebanon is a strategic priority for the US, given that in many ways it cements the marginalization of Hezbollah, it assuages US concerns vis-a-vis the likelihood of a force in Lebanon posing a real threat to Israel, and Iran's presence as well. So maybe now that means Europe comes in and can play a much bigger role, and it doesn't matter if there's not so much coordination between the two. So I think this could play out in some uneven ways, but perhaps a bit more selectivity and a bit more experimentation.
Max argued that the Middle East is a hard power region. Do you see that changing as the United States takes a more unilateral approach, or does this leave European states as bystanders?
Well, one of the things that Max argued is that the European states and the EU is going to play a much larger role in defense going forward and in building up its own security capabilities. So on one level, you could say if the region is a hard power region, then Europe will begin to be in a better place to engage in it on those terms. And perhaps that means more opportunism, the kind that we saw from Russia when Russia intervened in Syria, that Europe would be in a better place to be able to step in and seize advantage of openings as they appear. But I do think that beyond hard power, Europe, if it forges this new strategic independence on the global stage, then it is going to be in a better position to engage in the Middle East on other terms. So again, Max talked about the size of Europe's economy, the degree to which Europe provides aid, even more aid than the US when you combine it. That means there are some strategic assets that Europe has if they choose to wield them in a more strategic way towards certain goals. And just the geography of all of this means that the MENA region is always going to be a higher priority to Europe than it is perhaps to a more isolationist United States. So I don't think now Europe is in a good position to play that role, but with the kinds of transformations that Max was predicting, I think we could start to see a much more strategic Europe in the region.
But the danger, of course, is that Europe is not unified acting in the region, but Europe is divided against itself. We've seen some of this in Libya, where France and Italy are arguably on opposite sides of that conflict. I'm not sure how that plays out. Again, as we talked a little bit through the discussion with Max, what we mean by Europe is a little bit squirrely. Do we mean the European Union? Do we mean these three powers in Europe that are members of the G7? Are there divisions between them? I think this could play out in different ways. Certainly, we've seen a history of UK-French rivalry in the Middle East. It's possible to imagine that reemerging, but it does seem to me that a Europe which is less tethered to the United States and which is more militarily engaged could also be a Europe that is more likely to be working across purposes with itself than we've seen for the last 5 decades.
How do you think Middle Eastern states are likely to respond to a more unilateral United States?
I think that they're likely to say yes and yes. They're likely to want to engage more with the United States and likely to want to engage more with states that are independent from the United States. We've already seen it with China and Russia, and there's I think, a growing sense in the region that we shouldn't have to make a choice. The fact that the U.S. seems more volatile and more unaligned, more transactional for many Middle Eastern states is an opportunity for a deeper engagement. But I think it also creates a necessity to supplement that relationship with other relationships, whether they're with the UK, France, Russia, China, others. In many ways, a somewhat more isolationist United States may make a slightly more internationalist Middle East because it can't count on the United States to do all the things that Middle Eastern states have counted on the United States doing since the British retreated east of Suez in 1972.
I do think this decreases the cost for Middle Eastern states to defy the US and the US administration's ambitions for the region. We saw this to some degree already with the plan that President Trump put forward for Gaza. This was a plan that certainly was not coordinated with any other international actors and then received really fierce resistance from a whole host of states across the Arab world and more broadly. So I think if the US is acting on its own, it becomes easier to push back against some of these ideas in certain moments. But I kind of agree with Jon. I think it also allows for perhaps some MENA states to be a bit more entrepreneurial in how they get the attention of the US, what kinds of initiatives they might want to engage on. And then they have more options for pursuing those, and they can pursue different partners for different kinds of aims. So I think I could imagine a lot of Middle Eastern governments feeling relatively positive about a lot of this as their options expand.
Jon, Will, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Marty.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Babel. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find more analysis on this topic linked in the show notes on the CSIS website, and you can find us on Twitter at CSIS Mideast.